fantasy world. I think there was a lot of 70s and 80s songs based on narcissism, because some of them I'm like, but the fantasy world, the narcissist actually introduces you to a fantasy world the day that you meet them. So they've created this world around them that's totally make-believe, but they believe it. And that's the problem. And they use it to escape from their mistakes that they've made and from shame and the black hole inside them, the insecurities. So they've beefed themselves up and they're in this fantasy world and they're telling themselves, I'm the best, I'm godlike, I'm in control. And maybe they even tell themselves, I have unlimited success, unlimited money, I might be a CEO, it's totally outside the reality of real. So they lure you in by manipulation, by mirroring you, by beefing you up, and making you feel really special. You're into this perfect fantasy world with them. Can you remember when you're with that narcissist and you're thinking, this is the perfect person for me? Where did they come from? This is great. It's like your soulmate just appeared out of the blue. And you're totally in love, and that's how they do it. So they mirror you, and then they future fake you, like we all know. And it just seems like sky's the limit, when you're with these people. It's their fantasy world, and it is part of their mask. So when they go into a shared fantasy in a romantic setting, you have to keep up your role. And remember, a narcissist doesn't look at a person as a real person. So you're not an individual. You are in a role and they're the puppet master and you got to do what they say because they're in control. They're the director, if you will. Or you're going to get fired, and you will. So you're supposed to uplift and be this perfect partner because that's part of their fantasy. And their friends and their family take roles also in that. And everything that happens around the narcissist is to serve the narcissist. And so you notice that, when they're around those people, they act very nice. They're always worried about if the narcissist is okay or, things like that, especially around their family. They're kind of walking on eggshells too because they don't want to go and listen to the rage and everything. Well, it's part of their control. And to keep their control, they do what? When reality sets in, and it eventually does, because reality is reality, fantasy can only go so far. And when it's pushed back in their face, then they need to avoid the shame that's going to cause, that what we're being told the whole time inside is true. So they don't want to do that shame. So they want to go back and get control back into that fantasy world. And you have to go with them, So what happens when reality hits and maybe you don't agree with something that they want you to do, or you said no, or whatever it was, and that's not part of the fantasy world. And so now you're not playing the role that they want you to play. So they get into a rage. They might go into a silent treatment. And what it is they're going to punish you until you go back into that role of the fantasy world. Because you see, in the fantasy world, they feel safe. So that covers their shame. They don't have to take accountability for anything. It's all everybody's fault for not playing the role in the fantasy world. So if you don't play that fantasy role, they'll devaluate you. And then because you've now been knocked off that pedestal. And basically, you never really all the way go back to the beginning, as we all know. We'll get little bits and pieces of crumbs or whatever, because you're still playing part of the role. You're just not up to the standards of the narcissist according to their fantasy world. And see, that's when the fantasy drops. So what happens to people when they're discarded after being in this fantasy world is they get crushed because it's a hard hit with reality. You come out with a big old confusion in the fog. You are trauma bonded with all the manipulations, and you were merely just playing this role that you could never live up to because nobody can be perfect, even in a role for pretend. And all it was to serve the narcissist. And the narcissist fantasy world was nothing like what they really are. And when that mask slipped, it was showing you who they really are.